Beverly Hills, California, March 21, 1987. Dean Martin sat in his darkened living room, staring at a photograph of his son. Dean Paul Martin, 35 years old, Air National Guard pilot, actor, tennis player, the son who looked most like Dean, who had his smile, his charm, his easy way with people. The photograph was from last Christmas, Dean Paul laughing at something, his arm around his father's shoulders. That laugh, Dean would never hear that laugh again. 3 days ago, Dean Paul's F-4 Phantom jet had crashed into a mountain during a training exercise in California's San Bernardino Mountains. The plane had disappeared into clouds and never came out. They found wreckage scattered across the mountainside, but no bodies. Not yet. Dean was waiting for them to recover his son's remains so they could have a funeral, so he could say goodbye, so this nightmare that felt unreal could become real enough to grieve properly. The phone kept ringing, friends calling with condolences, family members checking on him. Dean didn't answer. His daughter Diana was staying at the house, fielding calls, making arrangements, trying to hold things together while her father sat in the dark and stared at photographs. Then Frank Sinatra called. Dina answered, spoke to Frank briefly, then came into the living room. "Dad, it's Frank. He wants to talk to you." Dean shook his head. He didn't want to talk to anyone, not even Frank, especially not Frank, because Dean knew what Frank was going to say. Frank was going to try to make it better with words, was going to try to find the silver lining, was going to treat this like a problem that could be solved with the right perspective. That was Frank's way, always trying to fix things, control things, make things manageable. But Diana was holding out the phone, and saying no to Frank Sinatra wasn't something Dean had the energy for right now. He took the phone. "Yeah, Frank." Frank's voice was warm, sympathetic. "Dean, I just heard. I'm so sorry. I can't imagine what you're going through right now." Dean said nothing. What was there to say? "If there's anything you need, anything at all, you just call me, day or night. I'm here for you, Pally." Dean recognized the nickname, the same one Frank had used for 40 years, since the first Rat Pack shows in Vegas. It usually made Dean smile. Today, it made him feel nothing. "The funeral," Frank continued. "When is it? I'll fly in, doesn't matter where I am, and I'll help with arrangements if you need. Whatever you need, Dean." Dean's voice came out flat, hollow. "They haven't recovered the body yet. Can't have a funeral until they do." There was a pause on Frank's end. "Jesus, Dean, I'm sorry, that's rough. But listen, when they do, when you have the service, I'll be there, and I want to say something. I want to speak at the service." Dean felt something tighten in his chest. "Frank, I don't know." But Frank was already continuing. "Dean Paul was a hero. He died serving his country, flying missions, protecting America. That's how he should be remembered. That's what I want to say at the funeral. That he died honorably. That he was a patriot." Dean closed his eyes. Died serving his country. Dean Paul hadn't died in combat. He'd died in a training accident, a routine mission that went wrong because of bad weather and maybe pilot error. They weren't sure yet. He wasn't protecting America from anything. He was practicing maneuvers over California mountains, and his plane crashed. That's what happened. Not heroism, not sacrifice, just a terrible accident that took Dean's son away. "Frank, I need to go," Dean said quietly. Of course. I'll call you tomorrow. We'll talk more. I love you, Pally." Frank hung up. Dean sat holding the dead phone, that tightness in his chest getting worse. March 24th, 1987. Pierce Brothers, Westwood Village Memorial Park. The funeral. They'd recovered enough of Dean Paul's remains for a service, though the casket was closed. 500 people packed the chapel, overflowing into the courtyard outside. Dean Martin sat in the front row, flanked by his children, his face a mask of blank grief. He'd barely spoken in 3 days. Had barely eaten, had moved through the world like a ghost. His boy was gone. The son who'd served in the California Air National Guard for years, who loved flying, who'd gotten his pilot's license as a teenager. The son who'd recently gotten married, who'd talked about having kids soon, about the future. All of that gone, scattered across a mountainside. Frank Sinatra sat 3 rows back. He'd flown in from Palm Springs that morning, wearing a perfectly tailored black suit, his face somber and appropriate. During the service, several people spoke. Dean Paul's wife spoke about the man she loved. His sister Diana spoke about growing up with a brother who made everything an adventure. His commanding officer from the National Guard spoke about Dean Paul's service record, his skill as a pilot, his dedication to his duties. Then it was Frank's turn. He walked to the podium, looked out at the assembled mourners, and began speaking in that voice everyone knew, that voice that had comforted millions through song for 40 years. "Dean Paul Martin was a hero," Frank began. "He died doing what he loved, serving his country in the United States Air National Guard. That's not a small thing. That's not something to be sad about. That's something to be proud of." Dean felt his jaw tighten. Proud? His son was dead, and Frank was saying he should be proud? Frank continued, his voice gaining strength, taking on that tone of absolute certainty that Frank always had when he believed he was right. Dean Paul made the choice to serve. He didn't have to. He could have just been an actor, could have taken the easy path. But he chose to be a pilot, to wear the uniform, to be ready to defend this country if called upon. That takes courage. That takes character. And Dean, you should be proud of the son you raised. You should be proud that he died with honor, in service to something bigger than himself. The chapel was silent. People were nodding. Some were crying. It was a beautiful sentiment, delivered perfectly by Frank Sinatra. Except it wasn't beautiful to Dean Martin. To Dean, sitting in that front pew, it was the most tone-deaf, insensitive, infuriating thing he'd ever heard. His son hadn't died gloriously in combat. He'd died in an accident, a preventable accident. Bad weather, poor visibility, maybe equipment failure, maybe human error. The investigation was still ongoing. There was no glory in it, no honor. Just loss, just a 35-year-old man whose plane crashed into a mountain during a routine training flight. Frank finished his remarks and returned to his seat, clearly satisfied that he'd said the right things, had provided comfort, had helped Dean see the silver lining. But Dean sat there feeling something he'd never felt toward Frank before. Rage, pure, undiluted rage. After the service, during the reception, Frank approached Dean. People were giving Dean space, understanding that grief made words difficult. But Frank, being Frank, walked right up and put his hand on Dean's shoulder. Beautiful service, Frank said quietly. Dean Paul would have been honored by how many people came. And I think what I said up there about being proud, I hope that helps. Because you really should be proud, Dean. Your son died serving his country. Something snapped inside Dean Martin. He turned to look at Frank directly for the first time that day. His voice came out low, controlled, but vibrating with fury. Proud? You think I should be proud? Frank's expression shifted, uncertainty creeping in. Dean, I just meant... But Dean cut him off. My son is dead, Frank. Dead. His body was scattered across a mountain. They brought me pieces of him in a box. And you're standing here telling me I should be proud because he died in a uniform? Frank's face flushed. Dean, I'm trying to help you see... See what? Dean's voice was rising now, people around them starting to notice. See that there's some meaning in this? Some noble purpose? He died in a training accident, Frank. A fucking training accident. He wasn't defending freedom or protecting America. He was flying practice maneuvers over California and his plane crashed. That's what happened. There's no glory in that. There's no honor. There's just my boy being dead. Frank looked genuinely shocked. In 40 years of friendship, Dean had never raised his voice at him, never challenged him, never shown anger. Dean was the easygoing one, the one who laughed everything off, who never got worked up about anything. Dean, I didn't mean to upset you. I was trying to... Dean stepped closer to Frank, his voice dropping back to that low, controlled fury. You were trying to make yourself feel better, trying to wrap this up in a nice package with a bow on top so you could make a pretty speech and feel like you helped. But you didn't help, Frank. You made it worse. Because every time I hear someone say my son died honorably, died serving his country, died with dignity, it reminds me that he's just dead. And all the pretty words in the world don't change that. Frank stood there, his mouth slightly open, completely at a loss for words. This had never happened before. Dean had always been the one who went along, who smoothed things over, who made everything easy. I should go, Frank finally said. Yeah, Dean replied. You should. Frank turned and walked away. He didn't say goodbye to anyone else, didn't stop to talk to other mourners. He got in his car and left, and that was the last real conversation Dean Martin and Frank Sinatra ever had. In the weeks that followed, Frank called Dean's house several times. Dina would answer, would tell Frank that her father wasn't taking calls. Frank tried sending flowers, sending cards, trying to reach out. Dean never responded. Friends who knew both men tried to mediate, tried to get them to talk. Dean refused. I don't have anything to say to him, Dean would tell anyone who asked. What he said at the funeral was unforgivable. People tried to explain that Frank had meant well, that he'd been trying to help, that his words came from a place of love even if they were poorly chosen. Dean didn't care about Frank's intentions. He cared about the fact that Frank had stood at his son's funeral and made it about honor and service and pride when all Dean felt was grief and loss and the kind of pain that has no silver lining. 6 months after Dean Paul's death, Frank tried one more time. He showed up at Dean's house unannounced. Diana answered the door. Is your father home? Frank asked. I really need to talk to him. Diana looked uncomfortable. Frank, I don't think that's a good idea. But Dean had heard Frank's voice. He came to the door himself. The two men stood there looking at each other, 40 years of friendship between them, and a 6-month silence that felt like decades. Dean, Frank began, I came to apologize. What I said at the funeral was wrong. I wasn't thinking about what you needed. I was thinking about what I thought would help, and I was wrong. I'm sorry. Dean looked at Frank for a long moment. Frank, who'd been there for so many things over the years, who'd made him laugh 1,000 times on stage, who'd stood by him through divorces and career troubles, and all the chaos of Hollywood life. Frank, his friend for 40 years. "I appreciate you coming here and saying that," Dean said quietly, "but it doesn't change anything. When I needed you most, when I was in the worst pain of my life, you said the exact wrong thing. You made my son's funeral about patriotism and honor, when all I wanted was for someone to acknowledge that my boy was gone and I was destroyed. You couldn't do that. You had to make it into something noble because you can't handle things being just sad and terrible and meaningless." Frank's face showed genuine hurt. "Dean, please, we've been friends for 40 years. Don't let one mistake destroy that." Dean's expression didn't change. "It's not one mistake, Frank. It's who you are. You fix things. You control things. You make things manageable. But you can't fix this. And instead of just sitting with me in the pain, you try to make it better. And that's not what I needed." Frank stood there for another moment, hoping Dean would relent, would invite him in, would let them begin repairing this. But Dean just looked at him with that flat, empty expression that showed the grief hadn't lessened at all in 6 months. "Goodbye, Frank," Dean said, and closed the door. Frank stood on the porch for a full minute before walking back to his car. He sat behind the wheel for another 5 minutes, staring at Dean's house before finally starting the engine and driving away. Dean Martin and Frank Sinatra never spoke again. Not at industry events, not at mutual friends gatherings, not even when they were in the same room at weddings or funerals. They simply existed in the same world without acknowledging each other. People who knew them both were shocked. The Rat Pack, the legendary friendship, the decades of history, all of it ended because of one funeral speech. December the 25th, 1995. Dean Martin died of acute respiratory failure at his home in Beverly Hills. He was 78 years old, and according to his children, he'd never fully recovered from Dean Paul's death 8 years earlier. He'd spent those final years withdrawn, barely performing, barely leaving his house. The grief had hollowed him out. Frank Sinatra heard about Dean's death from a mutual friend who called him. "Dean's gone, Frank. He died this morning." Frank sat in his Palm Springs compound, looking out at the desert, and cried for the first time in years. He wanted to attend the funeral, wanted to pay his respects, wanted to say goodbye to the man who'd been his best friend for 4 decades. But Dean's family made it clear through intermediaries that Frank wasn't welcome. Dad wouldn't want him there, Dina told the friend who'd called to ask. He never forgave Frank for what happened at Dean Paul's funeral. "Please tell Frank we appreciate his condolences, but it's better if he doesn't come." So Frank stayed home. On the day of Dean Martin's funeral, Frank Sinatra sat alone in his house, looking at photographs from the old days. The Rat Pack on stage in Vegas, Dean and Frank in matching tuxedos, microphones in hand, making each other laugh. The photograph from the Kennedy inauguration in 1961, when they were at the absolute peak of their power and friendship. Frank kept one photograph on his desk for the remaining years of his life. It showed him and Dean on stage at the Sands in 1963, both of them in the middle of a laugh, Dean's hand on Frank's shoulder, pure joy on both their faces. That photograph represented everything they'd lost, not just the friendship, but the ease of it, the certainty that they'd always have each other's backs, the belief that some friendships were strong enough to survive anything. May 14th, 1998. Frank Sinatra died of a heart attack at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. He was 82 years old. In his final weeks, according to his daughter Nancy, Frank talked often about Dean, about their years together, about the music they'd made, about how much he missed his friend. "He never forgave himself for what happened at Dean Paul's funeral," Nancy said years later in an interview. "He understood, in those final years, that he'd said the wrong thing at the worst possible time. He'd tried to make Dean's grief more manageable by giving it meaning and purpose, but Dean didn't want meaning or purpose. He just wanted his son back, and my father couldn't give him that, couldn't just sit with him in the unbearable pain of it, so he tried to fix it with words, and those words destroyed their friendship." The tragedy of Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin's final years wasn't just that the friendship ended, it was that it ended over a fundamental difference in how they processed grief. Frank needed to find meaning in tragedy, needed to believe that loss served some purpose, needed to construct a narrative where pain had a point. Dean needed none of that. Dean needed someone to sit with him in the darkness and acknowledge that sometimes terrible things happen and there's no lesson, no silver lining, no honor, no meaning, just absence, just the unbearable reality that someone you love is gone forever. Frank couldn't do that, and that inability, that need to make everything mean something, cost him his oldest friend. They say the Rat Pack died when John F. Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, that the optimism and glamour of that era ended in Dallas, but the real death of the Rat Pack happened on March 24th, 1987, at a funeral in Westwood, when Frank Sinatra stood at a podium and said the wrong words to a grieving father, and Dean Martin realized that even 40 years of friendship couldn't bridge the gap between two different kinds of grief. Some friendships survive arguments, betrayals, even years of distance, but they can't survive one person trying to make another person's unbearable pain bearable through words. Because some pain is supposed to be unbearable, some loss is supposed to destroy you, and the only thing a friend can do is acknowledge that, sit with you in it, and not try to make it anything other than what it is. Frank never learned that lesson, and it cost him Dean Martin, cost him the friendship that defined decades of his life, cost him the man who'd made him laugh harder than anyone else ever had, all because Frank needed grief to mean something, and Dean needed it to mean nothing except that his son was gone. When Frank died in 1998, Nancy Sinatra sent flowers to Dean Martin's grave. The card read, "Dad always loved you. He never stopped missing you." It was the closest thing to reconciliation that would ever exist between them. Two men bound by 40 years of history, separated by 8 years of silence, united only in death and the permanent loss of something that could never be recovered. Some words can't be taken back, some moments can't be undone. And sometimes the worst thing you can say to a grieving person is that their loss means something, because to the person in that grief, nothing means anything except that the person they love is gone, and all the pretty speeches in the world won't bring them back.